Welcome, everybody, to the Let's Be Real Here podcast. I am your host, Rory Wicks, and today's topic, the Electoral College. I admit I have fallen down a bit of a rabbit hole in recent weeks, just picking topics that have like a deep historical meaning to it, and just going into them in general, and honestly, I kind of like it. It's kind of like those video essay things, but instead you just listen to it instead of having to look at me, so you're welcome. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm pretty. But anyway, so if there is anything historical that you do want to know about or like on the political sphere, let me know. I'd love to talk about it. But today's topic is the Electoral College, and I'm going to do my best to not be as biased as I am, but there's no promises there. So let's get started. The Electoral College was established in Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution. The Electoral College is the formal body which elects the President and the Vice President of the United States. It all began on May 25th, 1787 through September 17th, 1787, also known as the Philadelphia Convention, where some of the greatest minds got together to talk about the many problems with the Articles of Confederation, but mainly a weak central government. One of the issues at hand was how to vote for the commander-in-chief. At the time, no other country in the world was directly electing its leader, so they were trying to create a system from the unknown. Making matters worse was the deeply rooted hate towards the idea of central government from the founders, having just come out of a revolutionary war over issues such as this. One side of the table wanted to make sure that Congress had no say in electing the president, trying to avoid things like corruption. The other side didn't trust the idea of a popular vote, saying that the people lacked the resources to be fully informed about the candidates, especially in rural areas. Out of those drawn-out debates came a compromise based on the idea of electoral intermediaries. These intermediaries wouldn't be picked by Congress or elected by the people. Instead, the states would each appoint independent electors, who would cast the actual ballot for the presidency. From there, similar to the Great Compromise, came the debate of how many electors each state would get. The divide was between slave-owning and non-slave-owning states. It was the same issue that plagued the distribution of seats in the House of Representatives. Should or shouldn't the founders include slaves in counting a state's population? In 1787, roughly 40% of the people living in southern states were black slaves, who couldn't vote. James Madison from Virginia, where slaves accounted for 60% of the population, knew that either a direct presidential election or one with the electors divided up according to free white residents only wouldn't fly in the South. The result was the infamous 3/5 compromise, in which slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of allocating representatives and electors and calculating federal taxes. The compromise made sure that southern states would ratify the Constitution and gave Virginia, home to more than 200,000 slaves, a quarter of the total electoral votes required to win the presidency. Not only was the creation of the Electoral College in part a political workaround for the persistence of slavery in the United States, but almost none of the Founding Fathers' assumptions about the electoral system proved true. For starters, there was no political parties in 1787. As I've said before, they didn't like them. The drafters of the Constitution assumed that electors would vote according to their individual discretion, not based on a state or national party. Today, most electors are bound to vote for their party's candidate, so not in any way what the founders had imagined. And even more important, the Constitution actually says nothing about how the states should allot their electoral votes. The assumption was that either the electors' vote would be counted individually, but over time, all states but Maine and Nebraska passed laws to give all of their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the state's popular vote count, known as a winner-take-all. The founders also assumed that most elections would ultimately be decided by the House of Representatives. According to the Constitution, if no single candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes, the decision goes to the House, where each state gets just one vote. This, with the winner-take-all strategy, almost cannot happen. After the unanimous election of George Washington as the nation's first president, the founders figured that later elections would feature tons of candidates who would divide up electoral votes, giving Congress a chance to pick the winner, since no one would have a majority. So similar to the vice president, who initially was supposed to be a voice between Congress and the executive branch, the House of Representatives was supposed to have the final say on the election. This is not the case because the state has passed laws for this winner-take-all strategy. And as soon as national political parties formed, the number of presidential candidates shrank. Only 2 U.S. elections have actually been decided by the House, and the last one was in 1824. It seems safe to say that as much as originalists like to treat the Constitution as some sort of Ten Commandment equivalent, it's been made pretty crystal clear what the founders' intentions were, and we're not even in the same fucking universe as that. So if the concept of originalism is to find the meaning and the intention of the open-worded vagueness that is the Constitution, then why are laws like winner-take-all not made unconstitutional? Because it seems to me to be the exact opposite of what their intentions were. Speaking of originalism, just real quick, I think that the founders used this flexible, open-ended language like cruel and unusual without explaining exactly what they mean because they were deliberately inviting future generations to interpret and reinterpret these words, which is the very opposite of what textualists and originalists propose. I actually read an opinion piece on this in the New York Times, and they worded it way better than I could, so I'm just going to read a portion from it. The founders were not dummies. They knew that society would evolve in unforeseeable ways, morally, socially, politically, technologically, and that this inexorable evolution might bring about unforeseeable applications of the same words. For example, instead of using the imprecise phrase cruel and unusual to lock in any particular punishment like the death penalty, it stands to reason that they meant it to lock out whatever punishments future generations deem unconscionable. So, true originalism, genuinely following the founders' intent, requires us moderns to interpret constitutional language in light of our own, not their moral and linguistic norms. So, in order for our country to advance and move on, in my opinion, not only do we need to understand and read the Constitution as it's written, but we need to understand and interpret it from a modern perspective. Because what was true 200 plus years ago is likely not true now. Societies grow, they change, and they expand. The founders knew this. They wanted this country to be the best in the world, the land of the free, not the land of 1776 forever. Only interpreting the Constitution from their perspective and intent will never let us advance because, by that logic, gay marriage and abortion would never be legal because they would never accept that shit in 1776. And yes, I understand that it's more complicated than that, so if you do ever want to debate me about it, reach out. I'd be happy to. But that's enough sidetracking about originalism. Let's go back to the Electoral College. So now we know why it was made, essentially as a compromise to slave-owning states, but how does it work? Well, the Electoral College has 538 votes. That's 438 for the number of seats in the House and 100 for the number of senators. The votes are then given out by the states according to population, right? Well, kind of. Every state gets a minimum of 3 votes. Then they are given out by population. But this leads to several states getting not as many votes as they should have, and some states getting more than they should. For example, Rhode Island should have 2 votes, but instead it has 4. Georgia, Virginia, Michigan, and New Jersey each have 1 less vote than they should. Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Ohio, Indiana, they each have 2 less votes than they should. Florida has 4 less, New York has 5 less, Texas has 6 less, and California has 10 less. It's essentially pretending that more people live where they don't and less people live where they do. And I think the idea was initially to try and give more weight to smaller states, to have a more equal voice to the larger states, and then forcing candidates to campaign more in the smaller states. It, however, has not worked out that way. In 2016, only 18 of the 50 states had any visits. Why? Because of this winner-take-all policy for electoral votes, states that the candidates feel they have, like, on lockdown, they don't have to visit because as long as they win by 1 vote, they get all of the electoral votes. So why would a Democratic candidate waste time campaigning in California when they feel that state's a guarantee. Instead, they can spend their time campaigning in Ohio or Michigan or Pennsylvania, where the race is much closer. And yeah, campaigning helps, but I feel like it's a lot less important than it used to be because of how much technology we have. Social media has changed the landscape of how these elections work. For example, you don't need to go to a town hall to get your questions answered. For the most part, you can just go on the campaign website, and most of the time they'll have an answer to your question there. Some politicians even have people manning their social media to respond to questions and tweets. They reshare things and they show their opinion and support all the time. So you don't need to go far to see how they're going to address almost any issue in the country at any moment. Now, I'm not saying that campaigning is completely pointless, because it's not. And honestly, going to a rally can be fun for both us and the candidates. There's nothing like a live show, be it music or a presidential candidate. And one day, there'll be another candidate on the ballot that I actually want to go and see, that I believe in, instead of this flaming pile of shit that we've been handed. Funnily enough, all of this has been an issue since the Electoral College was enacted. James Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, was very disturbed by the state's winner-take-all rule, which he considered one of the central flaws of the Electoral College as it took shape in the early 19th century. In fact, he actually called for a constitutional amendment against it. You hear that, originalists and Republicans? The father of your document hated this shit too. But if we did get rid of the winner-take-all, would it be better? Maybe. It'd be a lot harder to win, and in my opinion, it would open up space for more third parties or other candidates. But the reality is, that is only one of the issues with the way the Electoral College is used. Moving towards a popular vote is going to put us back in line with other nations and is going to give more power to the people for electing their commander-in-chief. It takes out the clearly flawed system and moves us towards an actual democracy. I saw a breakdown of electoral votes that showed that if a candidate won all the right states because of winner-take-all, they could actually win only 22% of the popular vote, but still win the presidency because they'll have the 270 required votes. 22% of the popular vote. So what is the likelihood of that happening? I don't know. Probably small, but why in the fuck are we using a system that's fundamentally broken? One argument I hear all the time is that the Electoral College prevents the cities, big cities, from deciding the election, since the majority of Americans live there. Well, the facts say that the top 10 cities in the U.S. only account for 7.9% of the population, so I don't think that's as accurate as they think it is. And the primary reason for its existence was this fear that the people are uninformed or that they couldn't make an informed decision because of how much time it takes for information to get from Washington to the people. But that's clearly not the case anymore. The argument went out with the days of the internet. Every average Joe, myself included, can be informed. Though I guess on the flip side, the internet has created things like QAnon. And that's a whole issue within itself that I should probably do an episode on, but we're talking about the Electoral College today. So, why does the Electoral College still exist? Well, mostly because there's not been enough people saying that it should go away, until leaders like Elizabeth Warren started really shedding to light how broken the Electoral College is. It really wasn't a concern for most Americans. Now, we're the only democracy in the world that does not use the popular vote to elect our leader, and we see why 5 times the popular vote has gone to one candidate, but the electoral votes have gone to another. 4 to 5 times the Republican candidates lost the popular vote but won the election. We live in a country that seems to have, at one point, prided itself on wanting the voice of the people to be heard. But now we have in the Senate where Washington, D.C. and U.S. territories have no voice at all. And with the Electoral College, Washington, D.C. gets electoral votes equal to the smallest state. However, the 4.4 million people who live in the U.S. territories who are citizens do not get any electoral votes. So if you're a U.S. citizen, but you live outside the U.S., you can cast your vote from wherever you are in the world. Germany, yeah, you get a vote. France, you get a vote. If you're in fucking space, you get a vote. But if you move to one of the U.S. territories, then you give up your right to vote. So that makes the U.S. territories the only place in the fucking universe where you can't vote for the president even if you're a citizen. Nonetheless, I don't think it's fair to say that we the people, the average American, are uninformed. People can easily figure out who they want to vote for, or they can blindly vote along party lines, and then we end up with Trump. Though, if we had gone by popular vote, he would have lost, so there's that. And how much different would this world be under Hillary instead of Trump? And who knows? I don't want to speculate on it, but Trumpers say that we'd be at war with Russia, and I honestly don't believe that. So, did you know that 65% of adults think whoever wins a popular vote should hold the nation's highest office, according to an Atlantic PRRI poll last year? Me either, until I started doing research about this. So once again, I come back to, if it's the will of the majority of Americans, shouldn't we at least be having a conversation about this? Well, for a second, let's imagine that we are. How would we go about abolishing the Electoral College? According to an NPR article, fully overhauling the way the president is selected would take a constitutional amendment, which would require the votes of 2/3 of the House of Representatives, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states. Support of that magnitude has become rare for anything in this sharply divided United States. An amendment hasn't been adopted since the 27th in 1992, and one hasn't been adopted relatively quickly since the 26th, which took 100 days from proposal to adoption in 1971. Even President Trump once supported the abolishment of the Electoral College. He previously felt it was a, quote, total disaster for democracy, end quote. But since his 2016 presidential victory over Hillary Clinton, in which Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, but Trump received 304 electoral votes, he's changed his mind. Now Trump feels the Electoral College is, quote, far better for the USA, end quote. Of course it's better now that you're the one that it was rigged for. There is, however, another way that the states are trying to go about doing this. Many states, and Washington, D.C. included, have signed a pact that says that they are going to give their electoral votes to the candidate that wins the popular vote. The total votes in this group are 181 electoral votes. So if enough states sign on to get the required 270, then the winner of the popular vote would guarantee victory. This isn't a perfect idea, though, because it could lead to situations where voters in Colorado, for example, may cast votes for the Democratic Party in the presidential race, but the state winds up giving its electors to the Republican because of the national outcome, and that doesn't exactly seem fair. So these votes could end up in the courts, and personally, this, to me, isn't the fix we need. It's a Band-Aid with a lot of holes in it, and the blood's still going to get out, and it's just going to cause more and more problems than it's supposed to help. And the reality is that without a constitutional amendment, no matter what we do is going to end up in court, because that's what happens here in America. And I don't think I need to go into why that's a really bad idea anymore, do I? As long as the Republicans are around, they're not going to abolish the Electoral College, since 80% of the time it's failed in support of them. And this isn't a call to purge Republicans. We need their minds. We need the conservatives. They are a balance to the liberals, and they are still allowed to have their opinions. But the Republican Party isn't the same anymore. It's corrupt. It's Trump, and Trump is fascism, and fascism isn't conservative. So the Republicans as a party need to go, or at least the Trump ideology needs to, but conservatives can stay. Just pick a new name. Passing a constitutional amendment isn't going to be easy, and I have no doubt about that. But I feel like we have to do it for this, no matter how hard it is. The Founding Fathers enshrined the Electoral College in the U.S. Constitution because they thought it was the best method to choose the president. But this was after great debate, of which the majority of the reasons listed to use the Electoral College then aren't relevant now. You could even argue it's doing the opposite, since the U.S. territories don't have electoral votes, so their voices aren't heard at all. There are over 300 million Americans. 538 people should not be speaking on behalf of us. We have the ability, we have the will to vote. In fact, it's our constitutional right. But because the founders didn't trust people to be informed, or they didn't trust the way that information flowed, my vote means less. on a day-to-day basis, I don't let people speak for me, so I don't want some Jimmy fucknuts telling me who I voted for either. In today's day and age, it's honestly kind of ridiculous. We're already letting, women, former slaves, and 18-year-olds vote, so it seems like the next logical step at this point is just to say goodbye to the middleman. It's just good business, right, Trump? That's all for today. And don't forget to like and share, but till next time, this is Rory Wicks.